We just spend an enormous amount of time learning stuff that is just not useful in the real world. We can also dig deeper and say, even when you do learn stuff that in principle is useful, our rate of forgetting is so high that normally we've just forgotten most of what we learned, even if we did learn it. And furthermore, there's just a lot of evidence that people are very bad at applying things from one context to another context.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy.
James.
Good snowy afternoon to you, Guy.
Yeah, we were not predicting this. I had no idea we were going to get snowed in.
No, winter has come to Oklahoma. Who would have thought?
And I don't think we've ever done this. Everybody is remote before. This
right.
is eerily reminding me of pandemic times when everything was a Zoom call. Hopefully we'll keep it lighter than that.
Yes. Well, we have a guest that I'm very excited about, Bryan Caplan. He is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a New York Times bestselling author. His books include The Myth of the Rational Voter, which was named the best political book of the year in 2007 by the New York Times. He's also written Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, Open Borders, Build Baby Build, Labor, Econ versus the World, and Self-Help is Like a Vaccine, among others. He is also the editor-in-chief writer for the Bet On It blog hosted by the Salem Center for Policy at the University of Texas. And today our discussion is going to center upon his book, The Case Against Education. And we'll also throw in a few questions from some of his other works also. Bryan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for being here.
Totally my pleasure. Let's do it.
All right. We got some rapid fire kind of get to know you questions, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. But to start off, how did you get into academia?
Well, let's see. When I was in high school, I really loved literature, so I got the idea I could become an English professor, actually. And then when I was in 12th grade, I got into economics. So then through that, I met a bunch of people that were professors, and I said, okay, I guess I could do that. And that sounds like a pretty good job. I did research with some notable economists, including Bill Dickens, when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And from there, I got my PhD at Princeton, and then that let me get my job here at George Mason University, which I've now had for 27 years.
You don't look old enough to have had the job that long. I'm just going to say.
I would have said the same thing.
Well, you're also a wonderful person, James. You're just at the top of my list. So I have never been out of school since I was 5 years old. And I will say the whole academic system is geared towards never take a break for any reason. Just go through school, finish everything, no gap years, no time off to take a job. I am currently on track to become the longest serving professor in the history of my university because I started at 26. I have a strong, solemn vow to never retire. So if I just get to the normal economist lifespan of like 110, then I'm set.
Excellent.
Nice.
Excellent.
Bryan, what's one interesting thing you're currently either reading, listening to, or watching? Your pick.
I am in the middle of watching Raise the Titanic, a 1980 movie that I saw as a double feature with Battle Beyond the Stars. I remember it because I actually showed up really late to the double feature, so I only saw the last 15 minutes of Raise the Titanic. It's actually pretty good, and I'm going to stick my neck and say Battle Beyond the Stars is actually pretty good too. They're both free on YouTube if you want to stream them. If you'd want to get a taste of what it was like to be a kid in 1980, just watch those two in sequence, and that was the double feature. of one of my favorite ones I remember. And you say these movies actually hold up. You can judge me if you want.
All right, listen, I was a kid in 1980, and I have no desire to go back there. So,
I'm a big nostalgia person. If you want the truth. I love it.
Guy and I talk about this all the time, and I am not the most nostalgic-oriented person for whatever reason. Now, if you want to talk 80s music, that's the one place that I will go. I would live in 80s music.
Or as some of us call it, music.
Interestingly enough, I also just watched Vision Quest on YouTube, which had one of the most famous soundtracks of the whole 80s. So you got Journey, you've got John Waite, you got Madonna. It's Madonna's first appearance in a movie, actually.
Well, I did not know that. All right, got a question for you. Next one is, who is the greatest economist of all time?
Milton Friedman is my favorite answer. Maybe Gary Becker. I mean, Milton Friedman, I ultimately appreciate him more because he was so much more empirical. Gary Becker, a lot of it is just very elaborate working out of the math. But if you really are paying attention, the math doesn't add that much. I think Gary was great just for expanding the areas where economists think about. But Milton, in terms of actual contributions, I'm going to put him at number one.
All right.
What is one thing about your work that you wish people understood better?
Probably just that I'm not angry about anything or anyone, really. There is this idea, and especially the idea that I'm trolling. Like, this is one where it's like, look, this is completely earnest. I'm not trying to antagonize anyone. My dream is that I speak and everyone's like, oh, great. And they clap and say, I'm convinced. I'm not trying to upset anybody. I just want to go and especially state the truths that other people aren't saying, which, yes, does tend to upset people, but I'm not in any way overstating or exaggerating. And if I can figure out a way to say it correctly without upsetting people as much, I'd happily say it that way.
Yeah, I can identify with that sometimes. There are people who just, they don't like questions being asked of their preferred, whatever their preferences are. They don't want questions asked of those.
Sacred cows, yeah.
Okay, so what's one belief that you hold that puts you at odds with either your peers, colleagues, or family?
I'm going to say free will. I believe in the hardcore philosophical free will. The physics textbook is not completely correct.
Okay.
So, I say, look, whatever that physics textbook says, I can go and violate it by a sheer act of will. And if someone says, what caused that? It's like, wrong question. What I'm saying is the direct denial of your question. What you're right. So I've had quite a few arguments with physicists, and I say, look, your theory can't actually explain what I'm talking about. And you say, oh, no, it's all in the textbook. Like, it's not in the textbook. The textbook does not even predict that people will feel pain, much less anything else about the mental world. So, I mean, you could generalize it more fully to, I am what's called a dualist, where I think that there's mental things are different from physical things. They interact. But the idea that the physics textbook just, if you fully understand it, that it then predicts everything in the world, it just doesn't. There's nothing in that book that says that anyone will have beliefs or feel pain, and they totally do. I mean, in fact, I am very fond of telling physicists, look, there is at least a understandable philosophical debate about whether the physical world even exists, but Descartes was right. I think, therefore I am. There's no doubt that I think and feel pain. I might be the only being that actually exists, but the physical world is actually at a lower level of certainty than what I am telling you.
All right. Wow. That might be one of the more unique answers we've ever gotten. That's funny.
On the other hand, I mean, I think almost everyone on some level agrees with me, and even the physicists, they lapse into mentalistic and free will language, and then it's like, language is not meant to be taken literally. Like, well, you seem to be taking it literally until I pointed out that it was inconsistent with your official theory.
I'm very sympathetic. This is not my area, so I won't call myself a full-fledged libertarian about metaphysical free will, but I'm definitely somewhere on that train. And what's funny to me is that's what I always think, is that like the folks who are going to come along and deny it, it seems like they probably go home and kiss their wife and play with their kids, fully invested in the idea that in fact they have something like robust libertarian free will. Yeah. Well, with that, let's jump into the meat of it. So your book, the background of your book, The Case Against Education, is the most basic background. It's just the fact that education pays off, but not perhaps in the way people usually assume. Could you walk us through some of the way, first of all, just some of the ways in which people with higher levels or tiers of education are rewarded and by how much?
Sure. All right. So the obvious one is income. If you just look at the raw data, college graduates make something like 70% more than people who only went to high school. Part of what economists do is to tease out what fraction of that is actually genuine. Part of what I do in the book is actually say that a lot of economists think the whole thing is causal, and I'm like, no, like that's wrong. But still, I would say that it's totally reasonable that a college degree raises your earnings by 40 to 50%, in a causal way. Right. So that's one. Other ones that seem where a similar story is true, namely there is a big raw gap. Some of the raw gap is not genuine, but some of it's causal. People with more education have lower unemployment rates. People with more education are more likely to actually be in the labor force at all. People with more education are, they are more likely to have a job that they enjoy, although that actually seems to be explained just by the income itself. So, but if we just say and then fringe benefits, actually, that's another big one. People with more education have jobs with better benefits.
All right. I was just thinking, because I thought I had seen something where people with higher educations tend to be healthier as well.
Yes. So that's true. That's one where I spent about 6 or 8 weeks reading every paper on it that existed at the time I was writing the book. What I'll say is that the range of estimates about how much education causally increases your health is very wide. There are a few papers where it's at the escape velocity level of every year of education makes you live like a year longer. And it's like, oh, come on. Those papers I do not think are credible. I think they got serious problems. There's one very famous paper that will remain nameless where I just found multiple obvious errors. And when I went to the authors, they basically had a series of excuses that went on for 10 emails. And finally, I just said, look, isn't the simplest story just that you made a mistake and are misremembering? And then they just cut off communication. But I say that the most reasonable estimates are that there's probably some very small health benefit of education. Even there, I think that the best story is just that more educated people, and media education actually does convince people to smoke less and be less obese, things like that. However, we should not regard that as a free lunch. As I pointed out, I think in the book, suppose that we show that sending people to monasteries extended the lifespan by making them celibate. It's like, okay, but that's a really high cost to live longer. And similarly, I would say that if education works by making people adopt abstemious habits, then at least to go and say that is a full-fledged benefit is jumping the gun.
Sure.
Fair enough, yeah.
Well, okay. So the debate that you're engaging in with this book is, why does education pay off this much and in the ways that it does, right? And you present 3 competing explanations for the relationship between education, skill, and income. And if I remember correctly, you identify these as the signaling explanation, the human capital explanation, and ability bias. And can you walk us through each of those real briefly, kind of help us explain what those mean?
Yeah, so ability bias is what I was alluding to earlier. It comes down to this. All right, so really rich people ski a lot, but does skiing make you rich? Probably not. I mean, you could have some story about how you meet business contacts on the slopes and it actually is incredibly lucrative, but probably not. It's probably just something that coincidentally rich people go and spend more money on. And then the question is, well, maybe education is also the kind of thing that people who are going to make more money anyway wind up doing. For example, maybe smart people tend to make more money and smart people tend to get more education just because it's more pleasant for them. So anyway, so there's that story, which is that education is not actually teaching useful skills or raising your income. It's just coincidence that it happens to be correlated with those things. Then there is the standard story that almost everyone hears about from the earliest age, which is that you go to school to learn useful skills and to get smart and all that stuff, right? Or maybe it's engineering. Like I've heard plenty of parents telling kindergartens, "You're going to school to get smart." I don't think so. But anyway, that's another story. And again, it's one where it says that school is teaching useful skills. And then as a result, you take those useful skills in the labor market. Employers say, wow, look at that highly skilled and individual, and they give you more money. Now, while I talk about it with sarcasm, I definitely think there's something to it, just not the whole story. And hard as it is to believe, there are just a lot of economists, along with parents, teachers, politicians, who really push this human capital story as the whole story, the absolute, total, complete truth. And that's where I'm like, no way. So then what's the last story? The last story is signaling. And this says, look, a lot of what's going on in school is that you're not learning useful skills, but the very fact that you excel or at least get through the system convinces employers that you are employable, that you're trainable. Or the way that I like to put it is you're getting certified, you're getting stamped as a result of the process. The system works because on average, people who do well in school are indeed better workers. And yet, if you could get through the system without really knowing the stuff that you had to learn, you would actually still be just as employable. Again, that's the extreme version of the signaling model. And then what I try to do in the case against education is sort out and say, how much does each story, how much of the truth does each story hold? And quick version is I say, look, there's a lot of estimates. There's a wide range, but still, if you make me just go and give you a number, I say the most reasonable story is that about 45% of the apparent return to education is just, or the benefits of education are ability bias. So subtract off 45%. And then out of the 55% that remains, I'll say something like 20% is human capital and the other 80% is signaling. So I do think that most of the reason why education helps people is precisely that you're getting those stamps in your forehead, you're getting certified, you're jumping their hoops, which is impressive. And yet you did not actually learn that much useful stuff in the classroom.
Interesting. So you definitely anticipated one of my concerns. So you're making clear that you are not defending like a pure or mere signaling model. That's a straw man.
No, of course not. I mean, like a number of critics have tried pinning that on me. And so like, how many times do I have to say 80% for you to hear that I am not saying 100%? I had a debate partner, Eric Kenyashek, who, he debated me, he heard me. And then at dinner, he said, well, Bryan thinks it's all signaling. And I said, Eric, I said 80% 10 times. And then he just said, Bryan, 80% rounds to 100, which has become a punchline in my family anytime somebody exaggerates. And it's like 80% rounds to 100, but 80% does not round to 100. Like in social science, the whole point is we're trying to put something more precise than just everything, nothing, 50% maybe.
Many of my students during finals week have made that exact mathematical argument to me about 80%. Yeah. But I was surprised to hear you say that you are, because when I was reading this book, I was wondering like who exactly your dialectical opponents are, because you use this term like pure human capital or human capital purism. And I mean, does that represent the real ideological positions of the people you're arguing against? They're just saying like zero signaling is involved. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here is what I actually have firsthand knowledge of. I know multiple famous economists who say, yes, signaling equals zero. Signaling is zero. And also ability bias is zero. David Card, Nobel laureate, has an 80-page famous article, The Causal Effect of Education on Earnings, where the usual reading of it is, like there's just no ability bias. Turns out it's total myth. And so if college graduates earn 70% more, it's because college caused them to earn 70% more. I have even met some very famous economists who said more than 100% of the payoff is human capital. And it's like, more than 100%? How can that be? And it's like, well, because the really good people like Zuckerberg and drop out. But Zuckerberg and Gates dropped out of Harvard. The best people drop out. And so really the people that finish are the dregs. And they make these high earnings despite the fact that they're actually the low quality people. And like, I've heard this and I'm like, look, you've got two names. Show me any normal measure whereby dropouts are actually in any way superior to people finish. Like all the evidence goes the other way. People finish are the better people by any measure on average. And the fact that you've got 2 ultra successful dropouts proves nothing but other than your own desperation. But still, I've had this stuff. But on the other hand, yes, there are, as far as I know, 0 people who believe in 100% signaling. I would know because I talked to all these people. I said, look, that just doesn't exist. So the caricature is someone who thinks signaling is the whole story. There are no academics anyway, no researchers to fit it, whereas there are actually plenty of researchers who are at least very close to that poll. And I have had plenty say, yeah, signaling 0, human ability bias 0.
Which sounds like a very bold claim for any social scientist to make about anything, frankly.
Yes. Like a big chunk of it is if you'd only read David Card, he has just proven ability bias is just a myth. And it might seem implausible to you, but if you had read the cutting edge papers, you too would understand. Like I've read those papers. They're not that good. Right? They would not convince any person with common sense, right? Especially if they'd read the other papers. And it's like, okay, so you got a few papers saying that, and there's a bunch of other papers saying the opposite. And the reaction I've gotten is, yeah, all those other papers don't count. They're like low tech. And it's like, okay, but the low tech thing works. Why do you think that the low tech thing is so terrible? It's like saying a pen is because it's a pencil. So I'm not going to go and I can't read a pencil. I can only read someone finger painting on a tablet. It's like, look, the pencil works. The fact that it's low tech is beside the point.
Fair enough. So if you're defending this mixed model, is this in a sense a debate about the value of certain subjects covered in various levels of education? And if so, for example, is this a dispute about maybe the instrumental value of, say, a liberal arts education?
Yeah, great question. So what I'll say is we've got very good evidence that some majors give higher earnings than others. The ones that give higher earnings, they do tend to look relatively vocational. So the highest earning ones are basically electrical engineering, computer science, mechanical engineering, finance, and economics is about number 5. All right, that's one we're like, well, I know economics. We're not really that vocational, actually. There's a few vocational skills we teach, but maybe the other 4, I guess. And then if you go and look at the bottom, they look quite unvocational. So the bottom is like fine arts. Education itself, maybe that one is kind of vocational, or at least officially. It's like we're training future teachers. And then like archaeology, anthropology, those are near the bottom. What I'd say is that there is a tendency for higher earning majors to look more vocational, but it's not an overwhelming tendency. And then in terms of, like, is it just the case that like the higher, like those vocational ones, those are totally human capital and the low earning ones are totally signaling? I think that's wrong. It's very tempting to believe that, but if you go and talk to people that are in what you think of as ultra vocational majors, usually off the record, they'll admit that they spend a lot of time doing complete nonsense or stuff that is not practical. So my dad is a PhD in electrical engineering. He spent a lot of time on proofs in classes. Do you know how much time he spent on proofs when he was actually working for Hughes Aircraft? No time. Or like here's another one that I didn't just talk to people in computers. So there's actually 2 different programs. There's computers programming and there is software engineering. Software engineering generally is agreed to actually teach more skills, but the earnings are lower because they think that it's where the dumb people go, or the relatively dumb people. Or one of my favorite ones is law school. Doesn't law school sound totally vocational? It's like they go there and they train you to be a lawyer. And yet if you talk to someone that has been through law school, what do you do in the first year of law school? You learn the law of 12th century England, which is in some ways similar to what we have now, but in many ways totally different. And so the idea that it's the low earning majors that have signaling and the high earning majors are just doing human capital, I think that's really oversimplified. Honestly, I don't know of any paper that even tried to really sort out the signaling shares by majors. In the economics of education, even paying attention to what is the person's major is a fairly narrow subfield. So I want to say there's maybe 50 to 100 papers on the effect of the major. But it's sort of on its own area. Normally when economists just study education, they just put in education years and they don't pay any attention to what you studied. Probably because normally the data set doesn't even say what your major was. So they're just looking for the trees or looking for the keys under the street light because it's brighter there.
All right. So I know you spend quite a bit of time on this question in the book, but can you give us some reasons why you think the signaling explanation is a better explanation than that human capital one?
Wow, I could go for all of our remaining time on that, so I'll just hit the highlights. So look, the very best and most convincing way to understand this is just to look at the world and see two facts. First of all, a lot of what is taught in school is just not useful in the real world, however you twist and turn. All right, so we teach foreign languages in the US. It's standard to do like 2, 3, even 4 years. And yet our knowledge of foreign languages is near zero, and there's almost no jobs in the US even rewarded. So there's stuff like that. We just spend an enormous amount of time learning stuff that is just not useful in the real world. We can also dig deeper and say, even when you do learn stuff that in principle is useful, our rate of forgetting is so high that normally we've just forgotten most of what we learned, even if we did learn it. And furthermore, there's just a lot of evidence that people are very bad at applying things from one context to another context. It might be that a construction worker learned the Pythagorean theorem at some point, and that would help him to do his job. But actual human beings almost never see a connection like that. All right, so I call this just the ubiquity of useless learning. And then the other fact is schooling pays. So really the only model that can reconcile the fact that there's a big effect of education on earning, but only a small effect on learning is the signaling model. The signaling model is almost the only story that fits those facts. So that is where I really do begin. And I'll honestly say that's what got me thinking about this. Because from a young age, I was just astounded at how irrelevant what I was learning was. You know, like, why do we learn trigonometry? And the trigonometry teachers, oh, you'll see. All right, well, all right, James, Guy, have you seen? You see how trigonometrically centric life is?
Well, very thankfully, I didn't end up taking trigonometry in high school.
Oh, really? You weaseled out of it, and yet you're still allowed in polite society.
Well, I don't mention it in Mexico, but yes.
So anyway, honestly, I would say those two big facts, and I've got 2 chapters establishing those facts from a lot of different angles. And trying to answer all the objections like, oh, well, learning how to learn, it isn't that you use history, you learn how to learn. Like, there's a lot of research on this saying that that is just wishful thinking that teachers tell themselves when they're teaching a useless subject. But it is not true that if you go and study a lot of history, then you will improve as a banker. It's just made up. All right, now in terms of more specific bodies of evidence. One is the so-called sheepskin effect or diploma effect. This says that when we look closely at the data, while education pays, it seems like graduation year pays an enormous amount and the other years don't pay much. If you're learning useful skills in school, it seems like every year should be similar. Definitely doesn't seem like graduation year should be the special year, because normally graduation year is goof-off year. It's slacking year. So why should that be the year that pays so much in the market? All right, so that's one fact that's pretty puzzling. Another one that we see is that it looks like education has a much bigger effect on the income of individuals than the income of nations. So if you give an individual another year of education, they usually earn about 10% more. And this is true even in really poor countries with crummy school systems. On the other hand, if a whole country raises its workforce's education by a year, then generally the measured effect on the income of that country is quite low. Maybe like 1/5 of what it is for individuals, which again fits very well the signaling story saying, look, for one individual, if you get more school, you get a nice stamp on your forehead, you stand out, you get a better job. But if everybody gets those stamps on their forehead, then we don't get everybody getting good jobs. What we get is credential inflation. We're all familiar with inflation for the last few years, right? Regular old inflation. If you print tons of money, this does not mean that everybody is rich. It means the prices go up. Similarly, credential inflation says if everybody gets good degrees, it doesn't mean everybody gets good jobs. It means the degrees you need to get a good job go up. And this is another body of research, mostly done in sociology, where they just go and compare what are the education levels for a given job, adjusting for changes in skill over time. And the punchline is it looks like there's been a ton of credential inflation, even for jobs where they are not harder than they were 50 years ago. So that kind of thing. Then I have just a bunch of common sense arguments, things like, well, why do students cheer when you cancel class? It's like, we're going to charge you full tuition. I'm not going to give you your education. See you later. And they go, yay, great. All right. And you might think, well, it's just because they're short-sighted. They don't know how important this stuff is. If that's a story, they could just cut class. This is extra joy at no one gets the education. And the signaling story, of course, is it doesn't show up in your transcript that the professor canceled class. It just means that standards are lower. You don't need to know as much material for the exam. Another one that I like very much is most people forget most of what they learn in school. Just think back to the classes that you've taken and imagine you had to retake the final exam right now, right here, right now, cold, and how well you do. Even classes that you got A's in 20, 30 years ago, you'd probably be lucky to squeeze out a C, right? And yet, in fact, there's a lot of classes we've done where we would just fail the exam and we would appear to be as ignorant as a person who never took the class or as someone who just failed the final exam the first time around. And yet, this is not the way the world views it. Employers actually treat you very differently if you got an A and then forgot the material versus if you took the class and failed it. Signaling can explain this because the fact that you got an A shows something good about you, even though you no longer know the material anymore because, probably medieval history is not relevant on whatever job you're doing. And like I said, I could go on and on and on and on, but that's my quick version or my medium answer to that question.
No, that's a really good summary. That you did, because I read through all of that. That was a fantastically brief summary. Fairly on in the book, I was really interested. You talk about several studies that are testing students' reasoning abilities when they're at various levels of their education. And you argue that the actual scores that we see are kind of bleak from the human capital point of view. So like high school seniors weren't really that much better than high school freshmen, and college seniors basically have the same scores as college freshmen. Fourth-year grad students had slightly better than first-year grad students. So if I understand your argument correctly, you're saying that if the human capital argument was correct, we should see way better improvements in that, much more dramatic increases in scores as you go up.
Right. Well, so in particular, the variant of the human capital argument where you say people are learning general reasoning skills, they're learning how to think, learning how to learn. That's what those studies are about, because those are not about the specific subjects you took. It's just seeing whether you're better at just dealing with a general intellectual issue at the beginning or at the end.
Okay. Well, I want to push back, play devil's advocate, and see how you would respond to maybe a pushback. Couldn't a human capital theorist look at these scores and say, actually, you know what? I think those are great scores. What if inculcating those kinds of reasoning skills really just is that difficult? First, it's just that hard to fight back things like heuristic shortcut reasoning because it's just so much more cognitively cheaper to do. Second, maybe part of the problem is that students' experience of the institutions of education is really this push and pull between a lot of people who have very different visions of what the purpose of education should be. And so they're experiencing all kinds of forces working on them, not univocal one direction forces. And then maybe even if, say, human capital champions were just handed a magic wand and say, like, fine, you go have 100% control over pedagogy and curriculum and everything you want. What if they still, we just don't know yet. Like pedagogy as a science is still like really in its infancy. And so we just haven't figured out some of the magic yet. And so given those kinds of obstacles, what if it starts to look like high school students, like freshmen scoring, say, a 1.6 out of 5 on a reasoning test compared to a grad student scoring 3.3 out of 5? What if maybe given all that mess, that's about what we should expect? How would you respond to that?
Right. So I think you got 3 questions in there. So let me see if I can remember them all in turn. And if I don't, maybe you can help me out. So the story of like pedagogy is in infancy. We're just not that good at teaching people right now. That's a story where I'm like, okay, so I'm right for the world as it is. And honestly, that to my mind is such an incredible concession to say, all right, so you'll grant me that I've correctly described the world that we know. Okay. And can I just get us, and that's the kind of thing, it's like, okay, pause the conversation. Let's get out a pen. And I just want to get signatures on that document so we can attest that I have accurately described the world as it is. Because of course, people normally will not give you that. Honestly, like I'm sympathetic to this idea that if not pedagogy is in its infancy, that there are better ways of teaching that are just not being used. And then the thing is that, okay, but we still need to explain why this crummy system that we do use raises earnings so much. And I think only signaling can explain that. On the story of, well, we get very small improvements in reasoning, but it's super valuable to have those tiny improvements. That's one where I'll say, yeah, that sounds pretty hard to believe. It sounds fairly desperate to say we went up from 1.6 out of 5 to 1.7 out of 5 over the course of 4 years, and we're going to celebrate. Right? It's important when you're reading those to see that they're showing like the first year of different programs versus the last year of the programs. And the point there is that people in graduate programs start off better. They're self-selected, right? And then you had, let's see, what was the thing you said in the middle?
What if we got this amalgam of sort of...
Oh, yes, that it's not univocal. Again, that's another one where I'm very happy to say, okay, maybe that's completely right. But again, that would mean that I'm correctly describing the system as it exists. You might say that there are some teachers that are improving reasoning ability and other teachers that are destroying reasoning ability, right? Like it might be some teachers are explaining critical thinking and other people are teaching them, if you disagree with someone, just say they're privileged. And that's your argument, and that's what you should do. And there again, I would say, okay, so you're agreeing that the system as it exists does not, in fact, improve learning ability or critical thinking, and yet it still raises earnings. So that's got to be signaling. That's almost the only story that fits those facts. And then, like, I'm actually, I can't. Let me put it this way: I could not be happier for someone to say, all right, first of all, your book is correct about in describing the world as is. I absolutely agree. Full victory for you, Bryan. And now could we discuss about how to improve it? And like, that's the kind of thing. It's like, oh my God, like I'm just going to shed a little tear here of joy. Like I can't imagine that anything I've ever done with my life could have been so effective. And then, yeah, I've got a lot of views about how to improve education as it exists. I think that there is good evidence that generally just gets ignored. Just starting something as obvious as, existing American foreign language education is basically a zero payoff. And yet human beings do learn foreign languages. So what in the hell is going on? It can be done. And yet we put in billions of dollars and totally failing. And the answer there, I will say, is the method that works is immersion, which almost no one wants to use because it requires cruelty. It requires you to tell the students, as was done, I had actual immersion German at UC Berkeley, and it was great. And I was actually good in one semester. But day one, man kann hier kein Englisch sprechen, nein. And anytime I said, but I don't, nein. And then I bite people's heads off. And like, that's what you got to do to get people to learn a language is like, no native language, not allowed. Das ist nicht erlaubt. And from there, you can just mold people through this extreme method into being able to speak another language. And yet what people want to do in America is let's all sing a Spanish song together. It's just like,
Okay. I want to pitch you a theory and see if you think it presents any problems for this signaling explanation or not. So what if in principle, higher levels of education really do or would increase human capital, but the ways we try to measure whether that happens or not are the real problem, right? So we have letter grades in classes, we have overall GPAs, we have diplomas and degrees at the big education milestones, and theoretically they should be measuring learning, right?
Yeah, or knowledge anyway. Yeah, to do learning, we have to have a before and after, but we can measure knowledge at least.
Right. But Goodhart's law kicks in. When a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. So the incentives are just too strong for students to chase that letter grade directly rather than pursuing learning and letting the letter grade follow, right? And the same goes with the degree. Students are incentivized to take blow-off classes to graduate sooner rather than taking the harder classes that would demand more development from them. That would mean that students gaming the system could be hiding kind of real human capital development in the data. If we focused on those students who did all the assigned readings, didn't wait to write a paper or cram for a test until the night before, chose to take more demanding classes, maybe we would see more dramatic improvements in scores on reasoning tests or abilities to apply knowledge skills across those different domains. So what do you think of that possibility, and does it pose any problems for that signaling approach?
Well, I'd say this is another argument that pretty much begins by saying, yes, you're right for the world as it is, Brian, but we can imagine a better world where you're wrong. And that's the kind of criticism I'll just say, keep it coming. I love it. But the idea that tests are just bad and lead to inefficient behavior, I think it varies very widely, right? The ultimate crummy test is one where you say, you need to know the answer to the following 20 questions for this test. Here are the 20 questions. And then obviously students just go, like, if they want to succeed, which of course a lot of students don't, but insofar as they do want to succeed, they just learn those 20 things and they're done. All right. On the other hand, there are wonderful tests where they are very good assessments of people's knowledge, precisely because they don't go in and they randomly sample from a vast area of knowledge and see how well students can cope with it. So for example, I am a huge fan of the AP history tests. Those are tests where to get a 5 on those tests, you must have a deep and thorough understanding of whatever the historical period that you are working on is, or you're working on that you worked on. So I remember doing those tests in high school, and I knew my stuff, and those tests totally measure, do you know your stuff? Because they don't say, okay, we're going to have one question about the Grant's or Sherman's drive to the sea. And no, it's we're going to cover the totality of the subject. And it's but which parts? All parts are fair game. Those are great tests. So tests where I think that they are not such good tests. Honestly, I think the SAT isn't very good because it is one where they aren't trying to get you to master a subject. They're just trying to go and get you to master some very specific skills. I think the tests do measure something very valuable, but if I were doing test-based admissions, honestly, my preferred system would be to throw out the SAT and say, we admit based upon the total number of 5s you get on the AP, and we count Calc BC as 3 and AB as 2. Those are the special ones. But but again, this is one where you might say, well, people just take every test. Yeah. If you can get 5s unprepped, then you're awesome, because the standards on those tests are actually quite high. There's a lot of people who get 4s cold just by using common sense, but you cannot get a 5 without knowing your stuff. So, I'd say there are problems with tests, but the problem is they're poorly designed tests, and well-designed tests actually are a really good way of measuring what people know. There is no such thing as a test you can't improve on. There's this ridiculous story of if you can improve, then it's an IQ tests are fake because you can improve on them. It's no, there is no such thing as a test that you can't improve on. Once I actually got to sit down with psychologist Steve Ceci, who is maybe the most knowledgeable psychologist on earth. He writes these incredible review articles where he has 1,000 citations and he just boils down the state of human knowledge on a subject. And I said, all right, Steve, is there a single test in the world where people do not improve with practice? And he actually thought about it for a minute, and then he said, no. So you can always improve through practice. The main thing to understand about test prep is that if it is just teaching the test, then you will improve on that kind of test. But if you take another test that is meant to teach a test the same knowledge, then if you only talk to the test, you won't improve. So that's a story. There's a lot of different kinds of IQ tests, and you can prep for each of them, but you can prep a lot on the Wechsler, and then if you try taking that preparation and doing the SAT, it won't carry over because it was very narrow training. It wasn't testing the really general stuff that is actually the target of the test.
Let me bring up something a little bit more recent maybe than the stuff you dealt with in your book, and that's AI in education, which is a hot topic right now. Do you foresee AI affecting the relationship between education, skill, and income in any way, and maybe featuring in this debate somehow?
Yeah, good question. So I did do an article on this there was a symposium for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I put, so I did a piece on that. In terms of how it's going to change education, the obvious things are cheating has gotten way worse, and some professors will just desperately try to stay ahead of the cheating, and others will just say, fine, all exams are in person with no electronics, which is what I'm doing. All right. So now in question of once there's AI, then will like AI become so good that human skill is no longer relevant, or maybe there'll no longer be much payoff for being a skilled human? This is the kind of thing that people have been predicting for thousands of years, and they've always been wrong before. And I think the future tends to resemble the past. There already are a lot of dramatic predictions about AI affecting the economy that are now proven to be wrong. It's like when GPT-3 came out, there were a lot of enthusiasts saying like in a year, the economy will be completely changed. And yeah, the economy isn't even remotely changed. Other than the main thing is going on now, we have like students cheating on their tests, that kind of thing. It hasn't even been used very much for phone trees for customer service, where it's a really obvious application, right? So in at least the medium run, I'll say that AI is going to change the jobs that people do. So in the short run, we barely see anything. In the medium run, we know what happens when there's new technologies, which is some occupations get replaced, and then we switch human talent over to things that the AI is not good at, right? And when people say, "Well, what will that be?" Well, I don't know, but we have always seen in the past that if you come up with a way of mechanizing human labor, that there's something else that humans can do, and living standards overall go up, even though it's bad for some people. So that's my general story. Of course, there are people saying this time it's different, and all I can say is I'm ready to bet you this time it's not different. Like, come up with some bet, and I will put money on it. It's not going to be different.
Have you or anyone that you know of been able to like incorporate AI into any portion of your classes, or get your students using them in a productive way that kind of demonstrates how it can be useful as a tool in some way?
So I have not. I have like the friends that are most optimistic have done things where they say, have AI write the first draft and then improve it. That kind of thing. Or have AI write the first 3 drafts and then improve it. Or fact check it, right? Since AI will hallucinate, you could say fact check it and make sure it hasn't just made something up completely. So there's that kind of thing. For the time being, I basically have just said homework's now optional. I'm not going to bother grading something that you could easily go and just put into the AI. If you want to do your homework, great. I'm happy to go and grade it still, but I'm not going to be your mommy. And then all exams will be in person, and you get failed if you look at your phone or even a watch. So get rid of all your electronics. I am testing whether you understand something. Honestly, like the GPT 3.0 still, like I gave, some people were saying it was great. I gave it my exam and it got a D, and I'm like, yeah, it's not that great. And then 3.5 came along and it got an A, and I'm like, oh, well, so it is good at taking my economics exams. And my economics exams, I do think of them as ones where they're testing understanding, not just rote memorization. So they're that good, but still, the goal is to get the student to understand, not just to go and type something into a computer, which would seem to be totally useless.
Sure. Okay, I want to shift gears for a second and ask about a particular direction you've went recently with your writing, which is graphic nonfiction, right? And so why is that an effective way of communicating ideas, especially kind of complex ideas? And how did you get involved in that mode of communication, and what kind of responses have you gotten to your efforts?
Right. Yeah. So bizarrely, what I'm doing, they're called nonfiction graphic novels. It's like, well, aren't novels fiction by definition? No, actually. Truman Capote described In Cold Blood as a nonfiction novel. So, but anyway, I first got interested in these books about 15 years ago, and I read most notably Larry Gonick's Cartoon History of the Universe. I was really impressed by how he just combined words and pictures to communicate more effectively, more interestingly. And it did get me thinking, well, could I do this? Well, I can't draw. I'm not going to learn how to draw. But I know there are people where they just go and make scripts and then they get someone else to draw it. And so eventually I did a few experiments with that, and I was happy with it. And so finally I said, okay, I'm going to go and try to do my first actual one. And I decided to do it on the economics of immigration. I was able to get a fantastic collaborator, Zach Wienersmith, and that gave us Open Borders, the Science and Ethics of Immigration. I was not able to get Zach for a second book, but I found another extremely talented artist, Audie Bronze, and that gives us Build Baby Build, the Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. the main idea here is in both cases is there is this big stack of fascinating research that nobody reads because it's too boring. And it's like, well, how fascinating can it be if it's that boring? It's like, look, the punchline speaks to deep issues that people do care about, and yet almost no one wants to read an academic article. So how can I go and bridge the gap and get a lot more people to pay attention to what researchers have figured out? That's the goal. I also think that by, like another way that I like to put it is, look, by doing it as a graphic novel, I think I first of all get more readers. I get more minutes of attention per reader because it is a lot more fun. And I think I also get more ideas communicated, or more knowledge conveyed per minute of the reader's time, because combining words and pictures is really effective at communication. Definitely a lot more effective than writing an academic article, which most human beings would just fall asleep even to try to read.
I want to switch gears as well too. We're both interested in all these other things that you've worked on as well, and want to get some of those in here. I'm guessing, as you're aware, the incoming Trump administration has indicated it wants to clamp down on immigration, not even just necessarily illegal immigration, but immigration. Let me just get to it. You've written that we need immigrants of all skill levels, and a lot of them. What has convinced you that the benefits of immigration outweigh the costs?
Yes. I mean, a way that I would put it is, so like, I don't like this language of "we need it," I think is hyperbole, because it's like, well, Japan, well, now their immigration has gone up a bit, but still it's like, will they die if they don't get it? Will they become a third world country? It's like, no. It's like, what I say is, it is an incredible opportunity for the enrichment of both humanity and the receiving country. So it's not that you will, it's just failing to let in immigrants. I say it is a missed opportunity rather than a disaster. So that's the way that I think is the honest way to describe it. What convinces me? This is something where you really I don't think you could find any immigration researcher who would disagree with exactly what I'm going to tell you right now. I say there are people who will object that I'm going to use it as I will, but this is just fact. Here's the fact. America can let in one barely literate, unskilled Haitian who doesn't speak English. He can show up in Miami, and a week later, he can easily be earning 10 times as much as he was in Haiti. Right? And it's like, all right, well, what's so impressive about that? It's like, look, by stamping someone's paperwork, you have multiplied their contribution to the global economy by a factor of 10. That's really impressive in my view. And if someone just says, who cares? It's like, in a way, it's like if that doesn't at least pique your interest and make you wonder, wow, how did that happen? How is that possible? I do think there's something kind of wrong with you, because it's like, look, just stamping someone's paper and now they're making 10 times as much. Right now, you might say, well, what does that really prove? Well, in a competitive economy, it proves that they are producing 10 times as much as they were before. Right? It's like Americans just pay someone 10 times what they're worth. That's a pretty crazy story. It's also one that's very easy to go and verify if you have a measure of productivity. It's like, well, we take a look at what a farmer grows in Mexico versus in the U.S. The same farmer, moving from his primitive farm in Mexico to a modern farm in the U.S., and you will see that guy is growing 10 times as much food as he was back in Mexico. You can see the same thing for primitive manufacturing versus advanced manufacturing. The only real puzzle is, what about the shoe shine? He's not shining more shoes when he's in Florida versus Haiti. It's like, okay, but the whole point of a service is to save time. If you save the time of more valuable people, that is a bigger contribution to the world economy. If you save 5 minutes of my time, that is a much smaller contribution than if you save 5 minutes of Bill Gates' time. So start with that and just say, look, we can see that just allowing an immigrant to come in, even a very low-skilled immigrant, dramatically multiplies their contribution to the global economy, to humanity, right? Now, the only answer I've really heard from economists there is, oh, well, but it only goes to the immigrant. Even there, it's like, even if that's true, isn't that cool? Notably, there's one famous economist, Paul Collier, who has one book called The Bottom Billion about how we really need to be super worried about the poorest people on earth. And then he has another book, Exodus, saying we've got to keep them out from the first world. And it's like, make it, choose one, man, right? So like this is actually an incredibly effective way of reducing poverty. Just let someone in and get a job, right? But anyway, also the idea that when someone's productivity multiplies tenfold, that they get the whole gain is just crazy and goes against everything else we know about the totality of economic history. There is no other example of a large economic improvement that did not greatly enrich humanity, and not just the people directly involved. Like the Industrial Revolution, textile factories did not just enrich owners of textile factories, right? They enriched everybody who wears clothes. Right? The mechanization of agriculture did not just enrich farmers, it enriched everybody who eats. The internet did not just enrich computer programmers, right? So it is just a general rule that anytime there's a large increase in production, it is widely shared. And then the only question that I say that is interesting is this. Look, so I'll say, look, anyone who is reasonable should just go and say, yes, everything you've said so far is true. And then there is a reasonable question at the end, which is, how scalable is this? If we let one immigrant in, even a very low-skilled immigrant, it is awesome for not just that person. It's awesome for humanity. It's awesome for that receiving country because they're getting the products that person makes. All right. So then the question is it scalable? We can let in one person and it's awesome. Can we let in 10 people and will it still be awesome? Yes. Can we let in 100? Yes. 1,000? Yes. 10,000? Yes. 100,000? Yes. 1,000,000? This is where the interesting question starts, at the scalability. And that's the issue that I deal with at Open Borders. What about all of these possible drawbacks? However, I will say, if someone says, well, it's never even been tried to go and scale it up that level, I say, au contraire. I was just in a country that has done what I would recommend to the highest degree that any other country. And I will just say, I went there, I looked at it, and it's fantastic. The country is United Arab Emirates. This country started in 1971. Since that time, they have multiplied their population by a factor of 34. They've gone from 280,000 people to almost 10 million people. Not by having tons of babies, but by letting in tons of immigrants, and not just high-skilled, by letting all scales of immigrants. They have multiplied the output of their economy by a factor of 200. Almost everyone there who's a citizen is fabulously rich. So it's like, why isn't that just oil? Well, it's oil combined with the immigration. Really, it's petroleum. It's not just oil, it's also natural gas, but it's petroleum plus the immigration, because here's the thing. If you didn't let in those immigrants and you just went and drilled the oil, which would be really hard without the immigrants, by the way, but if you just go and gave everybody a share of that oil without letting in those immigrants, who would deliver pizzas to all these rich Emiratis? Who would go and be their maids? Who would go and work in the restaurants? Who would go and take care of their kids? Who would take out the garbage? Like, the only reason why the model works is that they drill their natural resources, they distribute it to the citizens, and then they allow in an enormous number of workers, like something like 9 million workers that they can spend the money on. And otherwise, what would their economic model even be? It would be like, we give you a check and then you can move to another country where you can spend the money and get value out of it. Because otherwise, it would be like millionaires delivering pizzas to each other. It would just be idiotic. But they actually hit on the realization that it is not just high-skilled immigrants that are worthwhile. Right? Like, if the janitor at your office dies and someone says, yay, we're glad to see that parasite go. It's like, look, you're not just a jerk. You're also just wrong. That janitor did a useful skill. Like did something. And without him, we have to hire another janitor or take out our own trash and clean our own toilets. And that is a distraction from our other work. It is not just simple-minded humanitarianism that says that janitors are people too and add value. It is hard-headed realism. So yeah, that's my medium answer to your question. But I will say, Open Borders is, in my view, the most persuasive thing I've ever written. If you read that and you just say, this is a bunch of dogmatic garbage, it's like, all right, I got nothing else. I got nothing better to give you. But I do think that if you're curious about this, read the book. Like, if it doesn't at least make you ask some questions, my view is, like, I'm just puzzled if it doesn't make you at least curious.
Bryan, you've been very generous with your time. I want to allow James actually to have the opportunity to wrap up our interview here that we tend to do in a special way.
Yes, and we may have to have you back on to talk about some of the other stuff. I'm very interested in your discussion of why we should have more children, but we'll save that for another conversation.
Sounds good.
Here's the scenario. You're going to leave our podcast. You have two choices of what to do with your time. You can, choice number A, sit down and watch an episode of Seinfeld, or choice B, sit down and watch an episode of 30 Rock. Which one are you going to pick?
Yeah, Seinfeld, definitely. Seinfeld, I've watched most of those episodes 3 to 5 times, and to me, they totally hold up. 30 Rock, I watched like half of the first season once, and I said, all right, this is all right. But yeah, like I was not in awe or anything like that. I mean, it may be that I'm just not in general pro Alec Baldwin, although going back to your point on kids, once I found out that he recently had 6 kids, like I've just rethunk my view of the man. It's like, well, he's not my favorite actor, but now, like when he was on trial, it's like they are persecuting a father of 7. This is terrible. Obviously, it is just because he's a big star and they want to go and make their name. It was an accident. Like he's like an executive producer. He does not check the guns. It is not reasonable to think that he would. Like leave the poor man alone so he can go home with his family. Like, and yeah, probably in Glengarry Glen Ross was a good performance. Although, yes, the Team America parody still, I love that. But I'll never
Team
give that
America, come on. That is good stuff.
Yes.
That is even aged very well. It is still very hilarious in hindsight.
Our guest today has been Dr. Bryan Caplan, professor of economics at George Mason University, and we've been discussing his book, The Case Against Education. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for being on our program.
Thank you. It was a total blast.
Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the 2 best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.